All right, we are live. Welcome, everyone, to another live stream of the Biblical Anarchy Podcast here in the LCI Green Room. I'm Jacob Winograd, and I'm here tonight with Dave DeCamp. Dave is the news editor at antiwar.com, which, if you have not checked Dave and Antiwar and all of them out, you definitely should. I've listened to Dave a lot. I like his commentary. I think he provides clarity on things going on in the world related to foreign policy, and he has a commitment to peace. And we're going to talk a lot tonight about things going on in the Middle East pertaining to Israel, Iran, and kind of the ongoing conflict. And we're talking about it live, but if you're watching this a week later, I mean, things have been happening so quickly that maybe everything we're talking about tonight will be slightly outdated, but that's just the way these things go. But we're also going to talk about, because Dave is a fellow Christian, and so we're also going to talk about later in the show how faith and politics and sort of our views on foreign policy intersect and how we interact with fellow Christians and even non-Christians for that matter. But it's going to be fun. Please make sure, those of you who are tuning in, if you want to subscribe, if you haven't already, and give this video a thumbs up. That way more people can see it now and in the future. Greatly appreciate it. And that's all I have for housekeeping. Dave, how are you doing tonight? And thank you for being here.
I'm doing good. Thanks for having me, Jacob.
Yeah, of course. Now, you're, I think, someone that hopefully most of my audience knows, but do you want to maybe start out by giving people just a brief introduction, a little bit about your background, maybe how you came to be a anti-war libertarian and working at antiwar.com, and then we can kind of springboard off of that.
Yeah, so what I do for antiwar.com, I'm the news editor. Basically, my job is I sort through hundreds of news stories each day and kind of figure out what are the most important. And I write our own coverage of it, kind of short news summaries is what I have been focusing on there. So if you go to antiwar.com, you'll see the top news section. Most of that is my articles, my writing in there. And then I do a daily show to kind of cover that. But how I ended up doing this full time, I got lucky with antiwar.com. Just like a brief background, how I ended up writing for them. It was around 2018, I think 2019, that I started doing some writing, and I just submitted articles to antiwar.com, and they first started publishing them on the blog. And it was really kind of my anger over the lack of attention that the wars that the U.S. was involved in were getting. Especially in the Trump years, like all the scandals and, all the kind of the fake scandals while he was supporting this brutal war in Yemen and ramped up airstrikes in Afghanistan. And it was just as brutal as ever over in the Middle East. And just nobody seemed to be paying attention to it. Things, did wind down towards the end of the Trump administration. But in those first few years, it was, like I said, he ramped everything up. So it was my frustration in that, kind of seeing the opposition to Trump not even really going after him for the really horrible things he was doing. And it's because the opposition supported those things as well, especially, the war in Yemen, which started under Obama. And I was kind of involved in anti-war activism, like went to protests and stuff, but that didn't really feel like it was getting anywhere, when so few people are even aware of these conflicts. Now the conflicts people are much more aware of because of how horrific they are. And the U.S. is kind of more directly involved in some cases. But at the time, like I'm speaking specifically here about Yemen, which was just as, the brutality was on the same level that we're seeing in Gaza. It was just nobody cared about it. Nobody talked about it. So it's like you're going to go to a protest where there's like 5 people and nobody even knows what you're protesting. So it seemed like kind of trying to educate people, get the message out there was more important. And then my boss, Eric Garris, who runs antiwar.com, he's been running it since 1995. He gave me a call one day after I was kind of consistently submitting a story, an article here and there, kind of opinion pieces. And he asked if I wanted to be more involved and help with the news coverage. And then it kind of just worked. And then in 2020, during COVID, I was living in Brooklyn at the time, working on the Staten Island Ferry in New York City. They offered me the full-time job. So I jumped at that, and we got out of New York because it was just completely locked down. And we moved down here to Virginia. So that's how I ended up here. I wasn't a libertarian when I first started writing. I kind of came to that through my, being anti-war. It just seemed to be to me the most consistent position. You have leftists who want all these things from the government, but to pay for those things, you need the empire, you need the Federal Reserve, and all the things that fuel all these wars and everything in the empire. So yeah, and then I mean that's pretty much my story. So that's 2020. It's been almost 4 years. Oh, it's been over 4 years. It was September 2020 that I started doing this full time.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, I only became a libertarian back in 2018, and before that I was like a Democrat, Bernie Sanders, anti-war leftist. But I remember when I finally, like, after the Democrats screwed Bernie and put Hillary in, I became politically homeless. And once I, through like exploring alternative viewpoints, discovered Austrian economics and just connected the Federal Reserve and the way that fuels the war machine. I mean, that was very rapidly changed my political views in a few short months, because it does all connect. And I still love my. I mean, they seem to be having a bit of a resurgence. I love my anti-war leftist brothers and sisters, but yeah, there's some dots there that they still need to connect, I think. So we're here tonight to talk about stuff going on in Israel and Iran. I definitely sympathize with what you were just saying, where like there's so much stuff that's not getting covered. I mean, it felt like no one ever reported on what was going on in Yemen. This situation seems to have a different problem, where people are reporting a lot about what goes on in Israel and Gaza and Iran, although all you're getting is really just one side of the story. Or if you get maybe a different side, you're getting it from people who don't necessarily have the same commitment to certain principles and truth that you and I would have. Can we just maybe explain, because a lot has happened even just in the last several days, and I wanted to start out just by sort of sketching out recent events, just in case people might have heard about it but haven't had the chance to look into what happened. There was some Israel military strikes on, I think they were Iranian military targets. But I don't know the extent to the damage that occurred yet. I know Iran's made some, they were, before the attacks, saying that if Israel did anything, that there'd be consequences. And I know that the rhetoric since then has been kind of to, continue that sort of posturing. So what happened, and how is that situation unfolding?
Yeah, so this was early Saturday morning that Israel bombed Iran. And we don't know the exact extent of the damage. There's all these reports, in the New York Times, in Israeli media, that they destroyed all these air defense systems. What the Iranians are saying is that some radar systems were damaged, and that at least 4 Iranian soldiers were killed. So some Iranians were killed in the attack, members of the air defense force. So again, you have one side saying, so they took out basically all their air defense systems, and then Iran is saying it's limited damage. So some damage has definitely been done. Tough to know exactly the extent of it, but it was, significant. And this was Israel's response to Iran's October 1st ballistic missile attack on Israel, which came, this is one thing. If you watch kind of the mainstream coverage of this, they make it seem like Iran attacked Israel out of nowhere. But that was Iran's response to a series of Israeli escalations in the region. One of them being they killed Hamas's political chief, the head of the political bureau, while he was in Tehran for the Iranian president's inauguration. I mean, it goes to show Israel's intelligence has some pretty serious capabilities. I mean, he was staying in a very heavily guarded house in the middle of Tehran that was guarded by the IRGC, and they killed him. And then also when they killed Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, they killed a very senior Iranian IRGC official, and they've killed other Iranians in Syria. So this was the second time that Iran fired all these ballistic missiles at Israel. Back in April was Iran's first direct attack on Israeli territory. They fired missiles and drones in response to Israel bombing Iran's embassy in Damascus, Syria, which was a huge escalation. I mean, they bombed a diplomatic facility in the middle of the day. They killed a senior IRGC guy, and 6 other Iranians, and some civilians were killed. So the context is important. So, when we're talking about this October 1st attack, the only person that was killed in the Iranian missile attack was a Palestinian in the West Bank who was hit by a piece of shrapnel from an Iranian missile. And then the damage, they did do some damage to Israeli air bases. Israel also, downplayed it, so we don't know the true extent. But, there was a lot of footage of Iranian missiles making impact. So it showed that they got past the Israeli air defenses. Now, there was all this talk before Israel launched this attack on Iran that they might target the oil infrastructure, the nuclear infrastructure. And Iran was basically saying, if you do that, then, it's on. And there were reports saying that Iran was ready to fire 1,000 ballistic missiles at Israel in response. And like you mentioned, Iran was saying for a while, we're going to respond, no matter what Israel does, we're going to respond. But just before this happened, there was a high-level IRGC official. And if people don't know, I keep saying IRGC, that's the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. It's kind of Iran's elite military unit. Right before this happened, he kind of said, downplayed the threat of the Israeli attack, said that it would be limited, that they can't really hurt us, that we'll only respond if it's a big attack. So right now, what we're seeing from Iran, I mean, they're saying that they're going to respond in some way, but it's still kind of toned down. Like, I think there's a chance that they might not hit back. But the thing is, like, the trajectory of escalation, I mean, Israel's not slowing down what they're doing in Lebanon or in Gaza. And they still have been bombing Syria pretty frequently. So there's always a chance. I think some of the thinking here is the Ayatollah, it's been clear over the past year, he does not want a direct war with Israel because he knows that means war with the U.S. But after what Israel did in the past few months, I think the thinking changed. And they've said this. He basically said this himself, that they're not going to be restrained anymore, that basically he might not want war, but war might be coming to him anyway. And again, Israel can do some pretty serious things inside Iran. So, there is a chance if Iran hits back. This is the big risk, speaking from an American perspective. The U.S. supported this Israeli attack on Iran. There's no evidence of direct U.S. involvement, but they deployed a missile system to Israel and about 100 U.S. troops to defend Israel from any Iranian retaliation. And they did intervene directly both times Iran attacked Israel. So that's direct involvement. So if this thing does explode, I mean, this is the U.S. in a war with Iran. It's a huge risk here that the U.S. is taking by giving all this support for Israel. All the military aid has just emboldened Israel to escalate and escalate. And again, there's no slowing down, it looks like. And, with the U.S. presidential election coming up, Netanyahu calculates things based on, the political situation in the U.S. because Israel is so reliant on military aid and political support from the U.S. So there's a chance Israel might, do another big thing soon.
So you mentioned that this was a reprisal for, in part, the attacks that happened on October 1st, which I think everyone saw the footage. There was so much footage of the missiles coming down, and yet I think you said that there was only one death, which was a Palestinian killed by some I guess, like shrapnel that went haywire. I think a lot of people, like, they know that Israel has missile defense systems, but there was a lot of, like, conflicting reports about what happened October 1st. Like, did the missiles that hit, were those, like, intentional because, like, the Iron Dome only attacks missiles that they can predict are heading towards certain areas? Or was it that they were able to find weaknesses in the system, overload it? And I think there's even other, if I'm remembering correctly, there's more than even just the Iron Dome. So I guess there's sort of a mixture of defenses in there. So I guess some people were like, and I think it's helpful just to know, like, so was this, Iran showed that they can actually get past the defenses and there's a weakness there? Or was it more that, like, those missiles were never going to hit anyway? Because that probably makes a difference in how we interpret these events, because just like I think there's been a little bit of, like, slow escalation between Israel and Iran, but it's usually been just kind of like, hey, we showed that we could hit this target, but, like, it wasn't anything meaningful. Now it's starting to escalate, but people, some people are downplaying Iran's capabilities, and some people are, like, really, maybe fear-mongering about them. So I think it'd be helpful to try to figure out what the truth is there.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think there are people that definitely kind of overhype what Iran is able to do to Israel. But I do think that they did show that they could get some missiles through their air defense. And if they wanted to do a big attack, and really overwhelm it, they could get, if this was okay, we're going to hit Israel. We know this means war. They could do something like Hezbollah could get in on it. The Iraqi militias that are aligned with Iran, even the Houthis in Yemen, could all fire drones and rockets kind of to overwhelm the air defenses, and Iran could rain down, hundreds and hundreds of ballistic missiles. Again, they're talking about firing 1,000 missiles. I think they could do some pretty serious damage if they did that. And as far as how exactly Israel intercepts things, the ballistic missiles, I'm not exactly sure. But I think if they would have intercepted all the missiles if they could. There were some buildings damaged at Israeli military bases. We saw pictures of destroyed buildings, but again, they shared very little detail, and they actually arrested an American journalist who was going around trying to figure out the damage. Jeremy Lafredo, he works for the Gray Zone. He put out this kind of short 5-minute report saying, he found an impact site near the Mossad headquarters, and he went out to a base in the Negev desert and found some remnants of a missile. And they arrested him, and he's home now, but they were going to charge him with helping the enemy. So they really wanted to keep a lock on what kind of damage was done here. I
Wasn't
think
the saying goes that like the first casualty in war is the truth, but that seems like it's the first, it's the second, like it's an ongoing problem. I mean, I remember with October 7th, we still haven't had a full investigation into the exact breakdown of civilian deaths and how many of them were caused by Hamas, how many of them were caused by friendly fire, how exactly the defenses broke down. Like we haven't had a full investigation into that, and it seems to be an ongoing problem that it's hard. Like people are really putting, as you kind of alluded to, their lives or at least their careers often at risk when they're trying to report on what's going on in the region.
yeah. I mean, and Israel has strict military censors, so there are things that they'll take kind of extreme measures to keep certain things from coming out. And as far as an investigation into October 7th, I mean, Netanyahu does not want that. Now he's actually kind of riding high. For a while, people wanted him out basically for allowing October 7th to happen. But over the last few months, he's a lot more popular now that he's killed so many Hezbollah guys, that he's started this new war in Lebanon, and he's really kind of riding a wave. So maybe things are different now, but I still think he's going to prevent and the military brass, who were kind of on watch when October 7th happened, they also don't want an investigation like that to happen.
Yeah,
But eventually, we might learn some more things about it.
that would be good. So actually, you just mentioned Lebanon and Hezbollah. So how do they factor into all of this? You said that the death of the one Hezbollah leader, who I'm forgetting the name of, was part of what led to some of this escalating conflict between Israel and Iran. What are Israel's goals with Lebanon? What they're doing there, as they're kind of like fighting a war on 2.5/3 fronts right now. So like, what do you think their short and long term goals here are, and are they seeking further conflict up, with those north of them, or are they just trying to, uh, I don't know, is it because you get like conflicting reports, right, which like it's all about the hostages, it's all about finishing the job in Gaza, but then they're engaging in this stuff up north. So how does this all play into one another?
Yeah. So what Hezbollah was doing, after October 7th, on October 8th, 2023, they started firing some rockets into northern Israel. Nothing that really did any damage. And then that kind of started the back and forth. Then Israel launched some heavy airstrikes, killed a few people, and then Hezbollah kind of kept up the rocket fire. And basically, the idea was Israel had to evacuate these villages in northern Israel. And the Hezbollah's thinking was, okay, we keep up the pressure on the north, so that eventually they'll have to agree to some sort of ceasefire in Gaza. But that never happened. And so what kind of what ended up happening was, even actually when they were engaged in some ceasefire talks with Hamas earlier this year, the Israelis were saying, because Hezbollah was saying the whole time, if there's a ceasefire in Gaza, we'll stop the attacks. But Israel was saying, if there's a ceasefire in Gaza, we're going to escalate in the north. And basically what Israel says that they want is for Hezbollah to go, move away from the border north of the Litani River. Now they're saying they should go further back. And so when the 2006 Lebanon war ended, there was a UN resolution, I think 1701. And under that resolution, Hezbollah was supposed to move back from the border. And UN peacekeepers and the Lebanese National Army was going to fill in on the Israeli border. That didn't happen. But there's also Israeli commitments that, well, the thing is, when we talk about UN resolutions, like, people only make them sound important when they want to use them for their side's kind of, propaganda or whatever, because Israel has violated so many UN Security Council resolutions. But there is a part of it that Israel's not supposed to violate Lebanon's airspace, but Israel basically every day flies surveillance over Lebanon. And this is before October 7th. So, both sides were violating it in their own way, but that's what you see the Israelis say they want. That's what the U.S. says that it wants. But there's another thing going on here, and you could see it with the destruction in Lebanon. They certainly want to kill and destroy Hezbollah, but they've also been, really bombing, similar to what they've been doing in Gaza, just like leveling residential buildings. Now they're taking over little villages. They're having a tough time fighting on the ground. Hezbollah is still putting up a fight, even after Israel has killed a lot of Hezbollah leadership, and they pulled off that pager and walkie-talkie attack, which was really crazy. But Hezbollah is still putting up a fight on the ground, but they are taking some villages, and we see them demolishing buildings, planting explosives and blowing all the villages up. So, that makes you wonder, and there is an element of the Israeli government, of, the Israeli settlers who openly want to expand Israel into southern Lebanon. And I think that is part of what's happening here, because it's very clear now, you don't get this if you read American media or Western media, but if you read Israeli media, it's very clear that the Israeli government wants to annex Gaza. They want to kick all the Palestinians out. They want to establish settlements in Gaza. And I think that might be part of the thinking in southern Lebanon as well. Maybe more on the fringe when it comes to southern Lebanon, but when it comes to Gaza, it's become very clear that Netanyahu's Likud party is kind of leading this thing. They just had this big Resettle Gaza conference, and there was a lot of Likud party members that are in the Israeli Knesset, members of the Israeli government, ministers calling for all the Arabs to be kicked out of Gaza and for Jewish settlements to move in. So that's what is happening in Gaza. It's not about the hostages anymore. It never really was for Netanyahu. There's still 100 Israeli hostages there. They think only about 50 are alive. So
could Israel, if Israel had said, we will do whatever it takes to get these hostages back, would they have been able, in your estimation, to make moves and negotiations to get most or all of the hostages back early after October 7th?
Yeah, I mean, they did make a deal with Hamas in November 2023. A month later, it was a 3-day ceasefire, and then every day after that, if they released a certain number of hostages, then they could go up to 7 days. And it went through all 7 days. They released about 100 Israeli hostages, maybe 112, and in return, Israel released about 200 something Palestinian prisoners. So yeah, I think it was possible. The thing is that Hamas would have also gotten some things that they wanted, which was a complete end to the war, Israel to withdraw from Gaza. So it's not really clear what Hamas would have demanded beyond that. If they would have said, okay, now you have to, end the blockade on Gaza and do all this other stuff, then who knows how far it would have gotten. But certainly, yeah, if they wanted to negotiate something, it was possible. I mean, we were shown that it was possible with that deal in November.
And then I guess, beyond that, I mean, maybe if they hit an end to those, I mean, I guess the point of what you're saying, just to make sure I frame this right, and for the listeners, you're saying that maybe there was a limit, but they hadn't even hit that limit yet, as far as you can tell, in terms of what they could have negotiated for. And then beyond that, if they had hit that limit, you know, is there anything to what they're currently doing that could be construed as showing some sort of concern to get the hostages back? I mean, from my estimation, it doesn't seem like it. I mean, blowing up, large parts of Gaza, leveling it, escalating the conflict to up north. It doesn't seem to me to be like it, I mean, Israel has one of the best intelligence operations in the world, and you'd think they would be able to have intel on where the hostages are, attempt some rescue attempts, even with like uh, small operations and whatnot. But that doesn't seem to be something that, like, if they, you'd think if they would do that and they rescued any, they'd report on it. So like that's not ever bad. Like there are some things in war that they want to keep close to their chest, but if they were like, hey, we just sent some special ops and we rescued 20 hostages, they'd probably be like, front page and all over everyone's X feeds and Twitter feeds. But there's none of that, even though what you do see on everyone's Twitter feeds and on the news all the time is people showing pictures and listing names and stuff of the people who are still hostage, and it you can't help but feel like these people are victims, of course, but they were victimized by Hamas, and now they're sort of like sacrificial lambs of a sort to whatever the Israeli government and military is trying to do next, because it kind of like keeps the outrage fuel of what October 7th was very much in the forefront of Israel and its supporters.
Yeah, so they did do a few, like maybe two operations where they actually went in and rescued hostages. One of them in Nusret, I mean, they killed like 300 Palestinians in the surrounding area. It was like a huge destruction there. But yeah, no, you're right. I mean, they are just being used, and this is what the hostage families are saying. I mean, they're all very angry with the Netanyahu government for not reaching a deal. When Netanyahu was in D.C. and spoke in Congress, there were hostage family members there protesting him. Some of them were actually arrested by the Capitol Police during his speech because they were inside the chamber. They were released, but they were detained, and that's there was a shot a few months ago. Basically, what happened was Hamas's stance has been no more deals until you agree to a permanent ceasefire and a complete Israeli withdrawal from Gaza. And then Biden came out with this big proposal for a ceasefire that would have ended things permanently if it fully fulfilled. But basically, the way it was, the language was vague enough that Israel could agree to the first part, which was a 6-week ceasefire. And I forget how many hostages would be released, but a lot. They felt the language was vague enough that they could agree to that without actually committing to the permanent ceasefire. And the language was acceptable to Hamas, basically. But then what Netanyahu did was, while they were negotiating that, he'd go out and say, we're not going to end the war until Hamas is destroyed. He just kept saying that over and over again. So then Hamas made stronger demands. And then he said, oh, we can't accept that. So Netanyahu has been doing this stuff throughout. And then eventually Hamas agreed basically to the temporary ceasefire. And then that's when Netanyahu started adding all these other demands that Israel must keep control the Gaza-Egypt border. So, and again, if you read Israeli media, I mean, you've even had the head of Mossad who's been leading the negotiating team say Netanyahu is the one sabotaging the deal. So for Netanyahu, it's been clear it's not about it hasn't been about the hostages for a long time.
Yeah, it's just extraordinarily tragic. In terms of, I think you kind of talked a little bit about this, that maybe there's some sort of, and I think people refer to it as kind of like a greater Israel sort of plan, that there's like the hope for Netanyahu and the Likud party is to sort of use this ongoing situation that's developed over the last year to essentially claim Gaza and even maybe parts north of Israel and Lebanon. Do you sense that there's a lot of support for this from like the citizens of Israel? Because I know you said that the support for Netanyahu was low at first, but it's rising. And then, what do you think the response from not just like the United Nations and America would be, but also like what about the other areas in the region? Like how would Iran, how would Saudi Arabia, how would the other countries in the region respond if Israel were to start, taking more territory, especially if they were to like, completely, um, take over the Gaza Strip, and who knows what that would even mean for the Palestinians that haven't been killed by the military operations yet. But what do you think those implications would be if that sort of thing were to happen?
For the region, you mean? Like, how would the
Yeah,
other
like how would
countries
the other,
respond?
well, I guess both, like how would the countries respond, and do you think that there would be any, I mean, I doubt it. Like the UN doesn't have much teeth, because even if a lot of people complain about Israel, America would veto anything usually. But do you think there'd be any sort of consequence for Israel if they, internally or externally, if they were to carry through with that?
Well, internally, I think when it comes to the greater Israel, like expanding into Lebanon, the Sinai Desert, going to Damascus, I think that's a minority that supports that. But I think if it comes to just taking over Gaza, getting all the Palestinians out, there would probably be a lot of internal support for that in Israel. And then in the region, I mean, who can really do anything to Israel? The Gulf states, the Gulf Arab states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, they're not going to do anything. They're gonna might condemn things. The UAE might end its normalization deal, its trade deals with Israel or something, but I don't think it would really go beyond that. The only one who might really do something militarily would be Iran and its allies in the region, but they're taking a beating. I mean, Hezbollah, again, they can still fight, put up a fight on the ground, but I don't know. If they just take over Gaza, I mean, what really could they do besides just fire some more missiles? Um, so I think Israel unfortunately, is probably gonna um, be able to get away with it. It's going to take them a lot of time. I mean, actually, what we're seeing right now in northern Gaza is basically Israel is trying to implement this plan called the Generals Plan, which was written up by some retired IDF generals. And basically, Israel controls this strip of land that separates Gaza City and other parts of northern Gaza from the rest of the strip. It's called the Netzrim Corridor. And in that area, the IDF has basically bulldozed everything. They're setting up like military bases there. And there's about 300,000 Palestinian civilians in northern Gaza, and they want to move them south of that, basically so they could take over the north. Do it like they want to take it over one piece at a time. And they're basically carrying that out, trying to carry that out right now. In the beginning of October, they announced they ordered everybody to evacuate, but there's nowhere safe really for them to go. They've been bombing the safe zones the whole time. Also in the south, it's like everybody's just in tents in these crowded camps, completely, no sanitation. It's just a complete nightmare. So some people left, but a lot of people didn't. So now they're kind of going through little areas and basically just ordering all the Palestinians out. And it's under threat of death. They've imposed a full siege. No aid is getting in. People are probably going to start starving to death there. Maybe in large numbers soon. And this is all happening like right now. And this is another thing about the war in Lebanon and the tensions in the region. It really kind of takes attention away. It gives Netanyahu a lot of cover to do these things. So it's just, I think it really is kind of a ethnic cleansing extermination plan that they're trying to go through with right now. So
That's kind of what I've been saying is, well, I was saying it in the form of a question. I was like, how many Palestinians have to die for mission accomplished, for there
mhm.
to be peace? And it seems to be that, the only true answer, which is not an answer that I'm like saying with any sort of glee or happiness, but quite more like shock and uh, moral outrage, is all of them. Like either they're all eradicated or they're all completely dislocated to somewhere else. But I mean, otherwise, I mean, I think to some extent people have somewhat learned that they can't just keep the Palestinians there and not, and like when you try to bring up the idea of like, like, hey, like when you lock people in this region and you have children growing up and these circumstances, and they witness, the small scale skirmishes and violence that happens, from, like, think about the bombings and violence that happened from 2005 to October 7th, 2023, including there was like a lot of escalating violence in like the preceding month of that, which no one talks about. But like, I mean, it's not hard to understand how people are going to be like, raised in a climate where they're incentivized to join Hamas and or do whatever it takes to sort of oppose the Israeli government that's put them in that situation. And so, but when you put that to people, they go, "Well, yeah, but that's just why we got to wipe them all out." And it's like I don't even know. I guess I was over optimistic after people saw how badly Afghanistan and Iraq went, and it finally became like normal to admit those were failed ventures. I thought that people were more open to recognizing how, extreme military interventions and expansions and things like that aren't the right response. But in this conflict, it seems like people are just content to like, nope, we just got to wipe them all out one way or the other because we can't let this happen again. I mean, I don't know if I have a really question from that, but I mean, do you? It seems like you would kind of agree with my observation that seems to be like one of the more likely outcomes of what's going on, unfortunately. Or do you think there's any? Is there any hope that perhaps? I mean, I guess it somewhat depends on who wins the U.S. election, and even then, we have no idea what either presidential nominee right now might do. But I guess does it all kind of tie on like, is U.S. maybe the only wild card here that if they were able to withdraw support or put more pressure on Israel, that maybe there'd be the hope for a different outcome?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's kind of the sad thing about this is that, I wrote up this thing the other day. This Israeli rights group, Bet Salem, they were one of the first ones to kind of officially call what Israel's doing in the West Bank apartheid. They put out this thing the other day basically saying Israel is carrying out an ethnic cleansing campaign in northern Gaza and the world needs to stop it. And the sad thing is that the only way it's going to stop is if the U.S. cuts off military aid to Israel. The U.S. is really the only country with the power to stop this. And they don't need to bomb Israel or anything. They just need to cut them off because Israel is completely reliant. They get something like 70% of their weapons from the U.S. And it's not just a matter of giving them the bombs. It's the Air Force. It's the fighter jets. Pretty much all of their fighter jets are U.S. made. That means they rely on spare parts from the U.S., maintenance from U.S. contractors and things like that. The U.S. helps develop all their air defense systems. So, I mean, the U.S. has huge leverage over Israel, which they haven't used at all. And I mean, I don't have much hope right now. I feel like with Harris, it's tough to know what's going to happen after next Tuesday and like whoever wins. I basically see Harris just continuing what Biden's been doing, this kind of phony, like pretending like they care, keeping Israel restrained like just a little bit, keeping them from doing the ethnic cleansing, what they're doing now, like, in the beginning. It's kind of more dragged out with Trump. And Trump is such a wild card that you never know. But if he puts in some of the same people, if David Friedman's his ambassador to Israel, if Jared Kushner's involved, I wouldn't be surprised if they just try to bribe Egypt, just try to give Egypt whatever they want to let the Palestinians in and just be done with it. One reason why a lot of Palestinians in North Gaza haven't fled to the south is because they know that once they leave the north, that there's no going back to their homes there. And a lot of them are either refugees themselves from 1948 or the descendants of people who were kicked out of their homes by the Israelis in 1948. But I think if they were given the option, like to get out of Gaza, to get their kids and families out of Gaza into Egypt, I mean, who's going to, most of them, I think would take up that offer.
Yeah, I mean, it's such and people I think don't realize, and maybe you can touch a little bit on this if you if you know the answer. I've heard it explained before, but because people, if you say the Palestinians are trapped, they go, well, it's Israel only controls half the border. They say Egypt controls the other half. It's like, yeah, but like, and to some extent, I'm always like, I want to make sure I'm accurate when I say things, because you don't want to, like, it can almost sound like a meme, like, well, I'm not trying to make it sound like every bad thing that happens in the world is because of the American government or because of the Israeli government, but it's also naive to not understand that the US and Israel's government have a lot of influence over Egypt. I mean, I remember being in high school when the America basically did kind of a sort of a soft coup in Egypt. So I mean, it's are you still there? I think you froze up a little bit. Okay, you're back. Um, but yeah, I mean, if you so to what extent does America have sort of like uh a role? You said like maybe they could bribe Egypt a lot to take them. Well, I mean, is America sort of also maybe the obstacle to why the Palestinians can't get out of the way now and go to Egypt now?
Yeah, I mean, you know, this gets into complicated territory. It's like you wonder, like, because the Palestinians, of course, they don't want to leave, but at the same time, by not letting them, giving them somewhere to go, this has just been a dragged out, just slaughter. And I mean, when you look at what's happening every day in Gaza, and children are being killed at like a ridiculously high rate. And there's no denying that or getting around that. Israel always claims that they're targeting Hamas. They bomb these schools, sheltering Palestinians. They call them Hamas command and control centers, but they never show any evidence. And then you see the pictures and the videos, and it's all these women and children just getting slaughtered. Because if this does end with the Palestinians just getting pushed into Egypt, it's like, couldn't we just have, they just have done that in the beginning, but again, that's tricky territory. But when it comes to Egypt, I mean, I think, and this is something that the Israelis, there was a leaked Israeli intelligence ministry report in October 2023 that basically laid out potential post-war scenarios for Gaza. And the best case scenario, according to that analysis, was all 2.3 million Palestinians going into Egypt, building camps for them in the Sinai Desert, and building a buffer zone into Egypt so they can't, launch attacks from the desert. So I think that is what Israel ultimately wants. They probably would want the U.S. to fund it as well. And I think Egypt, they were preparing to build camps when Israel was getting ready to invade Rafah, which is the city on the border. So I think I think the U.S. could convince Egypt. Yeah, certainly. I think that that's possible. And the U.S. would have to put up the money too. And that's I think a realistic scenario, that something like that happening.
I mean, I would
Literally
rather
building like a ghetto for Palestinians in the Sinai Desert.
I'd rather my tax money go towards something humanitarian, at least, than continuing to destroy these people's homes and lives.
And that's the thing, again, from like, a libertarian perspective, the thing that the U.S. could do to stop this is to just stop funding it. It's not like we're saying you have to do these things for the Palestinians. If anything, the U.S. just has to step back. I know Biden and Brett McGurk, who is his top Middle East official in the National Security Council, they actually have this big vision for a post-war Gaza where the Palestinians stay, Hamas is not the governing authority, and that it's basically a quasi Gulf Emirate state. The reconstruction is funded by Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and the government is some kind of like from, like, I think the idea is to have like peacekeepers from like different countries, like different Gulf Arab countries, and maybe even the US, and then some kind of quasi government that's like run by different countries. So and I think it's just a pipe dream, because that under that plan, that's the Saudis normalizing with Israel. So that's what maybe they'll try to pursue that if Harris wins, but yeah, it just kind of seems like a pipe dream to me.
I have two more questions I want to get before we kind of switch gears a little bit, but I guess the first question would be, and this is a little bit playing revisionist history, which, again, no one knows, but do you think that there was a way, and you have to pick an arbitrary day and time, but let's say like we didn't prevent October 7th from happening. It happened. If Israel, whether America had withhold funding or not, if the response had been maybe to take out some Hamas leaders and, try to go after the people responsible, rescue hostages, but to do that with more precision, less destruction, and then to instead pursue, all right, like, we recognize that we kind of, I mean, you guys have done a great job at covering this over at antiwar.com. It was Netanyahu and the Israeli government that essentially, ensured that Hamas stayed in power in Gaza for as long as it did. That was part of their strategy to halt any talk about a two-state solution. So, like, if they had, like, kicked Netanyahu out and put someone else in, or if he hadn't been in power in the first place and this happened, and they had committed to a different plan of, like, taking out those immediately responsible, but then trying to rehabilitate the Gaza Strip to maybe, like, I don't know if a two-state solution could have happened in the aftermath of that, but maybe they could have just said, hey, we're going to just make the Gaza Strip part of Israel proper, but now we're going to view you guys as our citizens, and we're going to go after criminals who are causing problems, but now we're going to, like, try to take care of these Palestinian, now Israeli citizens, and make sure they're taken care of, they're represented, and do you think that that could have happened? And if it did, do you think that that would have, because when you present that to people as, like, I think this is, if you saw, like, that Konstantin Kizin video where he was criticizing, like, Dave Smith and other anti-war advocates, he was like, well, I always ask the critics of Israel, what should have Israel done? And to me, like, that's what I think Israel should have done. But do you think that would have worked towards creating a long-term peace and, defanging Hamas and, bringing some reconciliation between Israel and the Palestinians?
Yeah, I mean, I think something like that could have potentially worked, but I mean, realistically, I don't think any Israeli government would have done that with with the potential people who could have been in power. I think this was always going to be the result. Was this kind of what they did? Because if you look at the first few months after October 7th, when they were really dropping those big 2,000-pound bombs and just, like, leveling the place completely, that was, there was a report from 972 magazine, which is an Israeli magazine, that basically confirmed they were purposely targeting civilians. They called the civilian buildings power targets. And it said the idea, again, this is citing Israeli sources. The idea is to put fear and pressure on the civilians in Gaza, so then they, like, rise up and overthrow Hamas, which is always the way they justify, that's the way the U.S. justified strategic bombing campaigns and sanctions that punish the civilians. But that literally never happens, and that's probably just to cover themselves for, to justify why they were bombing the civilian targets. But, the immediate response was that kind of heavy bombing, killing all those civilians, killing all those children. So I think after that point, the idea of reconciliation was gone. So it would have had to be in that first few months, or in those first few days, first few weeks. They went in, what did they say? They said, we're fighting human animals, we're cutting off everything. Basically, we're going to kill them all. And, any Israeli, I say any Israeli government, most states, if this happened, somehow the U.S. was in a similar situation. I mean, you saw what the U.S. did after 9/11. And how people get in those times. Nobody's thinking rationally. So I think there was a chance, but again, realistically, just that's not something that would happen.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. I guess it's useful to at least think about that, because people don't, and you're right, most states and governments wouldn't do this, but I guess that's kind of our point as libertarians, is that, like, well, because governments don't do this, well, ask yourself why they don't do this, and then also, maybe this is part of the reason why, no matter how much war we wage and interventions we get ourselves involved in, we don't seem to find ourselves getting any closer to peace. So I guess that's kind of the point I'm drawing at. I guess the last question for this part before we move into some more kind of like the personal side of things here, because you already mentioned, Trump's maybe a wild card. I know some libertarians have kind of, like, hedged their bets with him because they think he's going to be less of a war hawk than Harris. And I'll grant Trump is, at least, like, if you look at conflicts with Russia and Ukraine, I think Trump's better than Harris on that. I'm not a fan of Trump's tariff policy, but I even think Trump could maybe be a little bit less hawkish towards China. But I'm not very optimistic that Trump's going to be anything other than, like, full support of Israel. I guess it's possible if there's enough people that get in his circle that they could influence him, but I'm not counting on it. So assuming that this continues the way it's going, I mean, future casting a little bit here, uh, seems like, just like America tried to fight a war to eliminate the Taliban and then long term failed, and now we have ISIS. I mean, even if they expunge the Palestinians from Gaza, I mean, would you agree that we're probably still going to see some problem of Islamic fundamentalist terrorism in the region focused toward Israel, and that this is only going to make it worse, even if like maybe Israel makes some short-term wins and like the conflicts going on drop in number, but long term it just seems like we're going to be you know sitting here talking in 15 years and looking at how Israel's actions led to another rise in terrorism.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Actually, something kind of really potentially big just happened recently that a lot of people didn't notice. I think it was 2 or 3 Jordanians, people in Jordan, attacked Israeli border guards, and they were killed. And then the Muslim Brotherhood in Jordan took credit for the attack. And the Muslim Brotherhood, you know, in Jordan, they hold about 1/5 of the seats in parliament. Um, that's not really their style. Terrorist attacks like that. I mean, it was attack on a border guard. I don't know exactly how it went down, but Jordan is a place, a very stable place generally, but they have a big Palestinian population. About half of the population is Palestinian refugees. So there's always the risk of unrest there, and they've been very unhappy with their government. So yeah, I think that the implicate, the reverberations throughout the region could be pretty serious, and especially when it comes to Jordan, and when it comes to the U.S. as well. I mean, again, it doesn't even have to be kind of an organized terrorist group to do something. There's so many Palestinians. There's Palestinian Americans who have lost dozens of family members in Gaza. There's always the chance of some sort of blowback here. And this is again just the brutality, the numbers of the people being killed in Gaza. Yeah, I think it's definitely going to have some long term. The region could look completely different in the next few decades because of this.
Yeah, I unfortunately agree. I was glad to have you on, not only to talk about kind of what's going on, both like immediately, and also kind of, talk about the lead up to this, and looking at maybe future ramifications. But I wanted to also talk about, because you're also a Christian who spends a lot of time looking at foreign policy and engaged in political dialogues, and this is actually good timing because when I scheduled you on, it was right before I went on a men's retreat this past weekend at my church. And I recently published a blog through my church where I kind of made like a very, subtle case for kind of like a limited government perspective from a Christian perspective using scripture and things like that. And people saw that and they were coming up to me. I think I had dozens of conversations over the weekend where they're like, okay, so what is libertarianism? And asking me about that. But then once we hit, it was always give them the basics. They're like, yes, yes, yes. When it comes to the economy, when it comes to, basic decentralization. But then when we got to drug decriminalization and anti-war, anti-interventionism, that's of course where it became really hard to keep those conversations positive, where I had to recognize that people haven't always read as much as I have. And so I'm trying to just ask thought-provoking questions to be like, well, you think Israel should do this? Did you know about this little fact here? Or what do you think America would do if they were in? So, things like that. What has your experience been like in terms of what's your faith background, and how has that impacted you in terms of how you relate to other Christians, as you are a very outspoken and very active person in the anti-war movement?
Yeah, so it's relatively new for me. I was raised Catholic, Um, and I was away from the faith for most of my life. Basically, from the time I was in high school until about last year was when I rejoined the church. Actually, yeah, it was last year. It feels like it's been much longer, but it hasn't even been a full year since I actually, because my wife and I, we had to get married into the church. I had to get my kids baptized and everything to, get back into communion with the church. Um, but I've always been, I've always believed in God. I've always been a Christian, even when I was, I always believed, but it was not really a part of my life until pretty recently. So it's been interesting. And so I go to a Catholic church, the big Catholic church that's near a big army base here in Virginia. It's in Petersburg, Virginia. And there's a lot of active duty military that go there. There's a lot of veterans because there's a lot of people who, served at the base and they just stayed in the area. So it's been interesting. I've talked to some veterans about this stuff, and they're like some older guys, and there's some of them who are just completely on board, like 100%, which is just amazing. Just from my experience from moving out here, we live in a pretty rural area. My neighbors are, Christian. They're Baptists, very conservative. So when I first moved into this house, they said, "Oh, what do you do for a living?" I'm like, "I work for antiwar.com." And then, their reaction is, "Yeah, we got to get out of the Middle East and everything." So, things have really changed because just from my experience growing up, I was in high school during the Bush years, and my experience as a Catholic as a kid was, pretty much everybody's on board with the wars. And that was one of the things that turned me away from the church. So kind of the shift when you do have more right-wing people are more anti-war now. When it comes to Israel, though, things are different, especially, there are certain Christians who think it's their Christian duty to support Israel. Catholics, there's nothing in our theology that says that, but there are still some who think we have to support Israel. But for the most part, like, it's very different than like kind of the,
Yeah.
dispensationalism and some strains of evangelical Christianity who do believe that they have like a theological reason to support the modern state of Israel. But yeah, it has been interesting, and it's something, I wish, because again, I'm Catholic and I'm back. I've had a reversion, basically a conversion, because I was away for so long. And so I consume a lot of Catholic content now. There's a lot of online, that's just the nature of the day, is that there's so much
Yeah.
online Christian content. And it got kind of makes me angry sometimes, because I'll see these priests who I watch and I really like, and then they'll say, "Oh, they'll explain kind of the Catholic belief that we have a moral duty to vote for the lesser of two evils," and they never factor in, except very few. One guy I know in particular who does. They never factor in foreign policy and war. And if you read the Catechism of the Catholic Church, it's very clear. There's just war theory, and you don't target civilians. And
Right.
none of these wars that the U.S. is involved in, can be justified by that.
Yep.
So,
Yeah, it's
it's
one of the
something. It can be frustrating when you see people who are, supposed to be your spiritual leaders not even like really thinking about this stuff.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. I mean, it's tough because, like, on one hand, they're your spiritual leaders, whether it's your pastor or if it's a priest or like a great teacher, and you're like, you can have a lot of respect for these people, and like, and you want to challenge them, but like, it's a little intimidating, and it's also like, you want to make sure they're receptive to what you have to say. That was actually one of the questions that came up over the weekend. They were like, "Well, don't you believe in like just war theory?" And I was like, "Yes, I do. Let's talk about just war theory and what it means." And yeah, it doesn't include targeting civilians. It also includes like exhausting all options for peace before you actually engage in war. And then it's like, I mean, I don't think anyone listening to just even like 20 minutes of us talking about what the Israeli government and military is doing can say, now or even a year ago or 3 years ago or 5 years ago, that they've been exhausting all possible routes for peace. And I just don't know, like, and there are some people who I've interacted with who are, yeah, fully on board and they get it. But yeah, like, there are some people that they just have this blind spot. Like, I don't know if you saw Trent Horn so he was on the Reason podcast a little while back, and he was just talking about libertarianism. But then after Daryl Cooper, right? I'm getting his name right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Daryl Cooper was on Tucker. Then Trent Horn did an episode where he was just like blasting Daryl Cooper, blasting revisionist history, blasting kind of like, the anti-war, the critics of Israel, and just kind of lumping all of them together as just basically being anti-Semitic and like, just kind of like uh, Nazis who are very quiet and very sneaky about it, which was just
Mm.
so like, I like Trent Horn a lot. I'm not even Catholic, and I like Trent Horn. I listen to him a lot because he's good on church history. He's even generally, I think, pretty good just on like basic Christian theology. But to hear him make the arguments and criticisms he did was just like such a gut punch and so discouraging.
Yeah, I was pretty disappointed with that too. And he just recently made, I think it was around the anniversary of the US dropping the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He made a whole video about how that was wrong, that was morally wrong, and that was against, what the church teaches. So, yeah, to see him do that, it was pretty disappointing. And I've seen him just in interviews make offhand comments about Israel and like, protesters. Oh, they're really pro Hamas protesters or whatever. When it's like, again, this is something that is just so against, what Israel's doing in Gaza is so against, Christianity. And so you mentioned, or I think you might have written it as one of the questions you were going to ask, how my faith has kind of impacted my work. One thing that I've tried to do is kind of highlight the plight of the Christians in Palestine, in Gaza, in the West Bank, which a lot of people are unaware of. So I interviewed Khalil Sayegh. He's a Palestinian Christian from Gaza who has family there, who's lost his family's been killed in this conflict, and they're all sheltering at a Catholic church in Gaza City. There's a Catholic church and a Greek Orthodox church, and they've both been. The Greek Orthodox church has been bombed. The Catholic church, 2 women were killed by Israeli snipers. It was like under siege for a little while. So these are things that I think are important to highlight. But yeah, it's just I would say my priest is actually great on all this stuff, which is great, which helped me. That played a big role in me kind of picking this church and getting back in. So, but yeah, it's something that I think just in general, specifically Catholics need to get better with when they're kind of discerning political stuff. It's like again, it's really just not factored in there.
Yeah, I agree. Have you had any luck with the people you've talked to and trying to you know, get them to dive a little bit more into the history and not just to kind of explain the political ramifications of it, but and this is a tricky thing, and I've done a lot of episodes on it, but because but there's a lot in Zionism that first of all, there's actually like hardcore Orthodox Jews who think Zionism is actually not even real Judaism, but Zionism, proposes a lot of things that are actually just like antithetical to kind of like the Christian worldview and how we kind of view in the new covenant the distinction between Jew and Gentile and how we view sort of like the uh, eschatology and what the promises of the Abrahamic covenant are now that we're uh, in the new covenant that Christ has established with his blood. And when you look at the history of like what the Zionist cause was, and then like try to be like, okay, now how do we reconcile that with like, our Christian values, like even going beyond just what we've already kind of highlighted, like just war, and things like that. It seems to me like we should also, as Christians, kind of have an issue with the Zionist project, especially as it's evolved, because it sort of uh, it brings out the worst elements of Judaism. Like it brings out the things that the early Christians were having debates over about, like if there was any specialness to being Jewish or not. And the apostles were like, no, there's not. And you don't even need to get circumcised. And it doesn't matter what you eat. And like all this has been worked out. And then it's like Zionism seems to, also just be like fundamentally, I mean, more so than just like Orthodox non-Zionist Judaism is still in conflict with Christianity, but then Zionism is like uh, it just sort of like uh, what's the word I'm looking for here? It exaggerates all those differences, in my opinion.
Yeah, yeah. And when they formed the state of Israel and pushed Palestinians out, drove them from their homes, there was about 10% of the Palestinian population at the time was Christian, and they were all pushed out, and they were very involved in the early kind of Palestinian movement for a nation. Um, and again, you see the way Christians are treated by kind of the hardcore Zionists, the settlers, the ones who really want to expand things. I mean, they spit on Christians in East Jerusalem and everything. Another guy I interviewed is an Armenian Christian who lives in the old city, the Armenian quarter, and they're under pressure from Israeli soldiers that are trying to push them out. And this is a Christian community that goes back to the 4th century, the Armenians in the old city. So, and that's not even, what you're talking about is kind of different. This is kind of the how Christians are treated, but yeah, the confliction between Zionism and Christianity. I mean, it's completely conflicted. But it's pretty amazing. I mean, I see a lot of people kind of blame evangelical Christians for the relationship between the U.S. and Israel, and I know that there's plenty of evangelicals that don't ascribe to that theology. I know specifically like dispensationalism. But it is amazing how much influence it has in our politics. Like Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, Mike Pompeo. I mean, all these guys, that is their driving thing, is that they want, a lot of them want the, destruction of the Al-Aqsa Mosque to build the third temple. It's really, they really want to bring about the end times through the modern state of Israel. And it is kind of amazing that actually is a big part of what drives this. I think it's more overall just, the Israeli lobby's influence, but they certainly get a big help from those Christian Zionists.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's a problem. Well, another element here in terms of just like the how our religious views interplay with this is that you'll hear a lot of people who just go, well, yeah, maybe Israel's government's not perfect, and maybe Zionism is not perfect, but they're so much better than just Islam and the Islamic fundamentalists and whatnot. And that's really the problem here. Like, it doesn't matter how much better Israel's government or the Jews there could be. It's just that it's the Muslim religion. It teaches them this holy jihad and all that, and that's a hard one to respond to because, of course, like, I mean, just as I would criticize Judaism, I will criticize Islam and point out the flaws. But I think there's obviously some issues there with a kind of like oversimplifications of what the Muslim religion teaches, and two, kind of like a discrepancy between how many Muslims end up becoming like Islamic fundamentalist terrorists. How many of them are like, you don't see that here in America quite at the same rate you do maybe in the regions where there's a heavy heavy and long history of American and Israeli government intervention and occupation.
Yeah, and I mean, it's tough to know what would Jerusalem look like if Israel wasn't there. But if you look at its neighbors, Jordan, Syria, Iraq before the invasion, you had these kind of secular, especially Syria and Iraq. You had these secular governments and Christians and Muslims and even Jews, coexisted and lived together. And it was actually, this isn't so much related to Israel. Well, a lot of it is kind of if you get into U.S. foreign policy, but the invasion of Iraq. After that, the Christian population of Iraq was basically completely decimated. Millions have fled, and it wasn't the U.S. directly attacking and killing the Christians, although I'm sure that they did kill some. But it was the rise of ISIS and everything, and that was created by destabilizing that country. And same thing in Syria. Damascus, I mean, is a really important city in Christian history. And there was, it was flooded with these Islamic extremists who were supported by the U.S. and Israel to attempt to overthrow the Assad government. So, yeah, I mean, I would guess, this is just, there's no possible way to know, but let's just say the Zionist project didn't happen. The Ottoman Empire collapsed. There was some kind of Arab government put in charge of Palestine. They would want the money from the tourism. Jerusalem would not be controlled by Islamic fundamentalists. It would be a place where lots of Christians, Muslim, and Jews probably lived. Now, it wouldn't be perfect, of course, but I'm just saying I think the money, the tourism that they could generate would kind of trump everything else there.
I mean, it wouldn't be perfect, but it's hard to get worse than what we have today,
Hmm.
I guess is what I would say. And yeah, I mean, I think what you said is exactly right. I mean, if you look at the British government and the American government from like the beginning of the 20th century through World War One and, past World War Two, it's like at every stage, those governments have combined to prop up and support and fund the more fundamentalist groups and conspire against the more secular or even more reform groups. And it's just like it just keeps uh, the incentive structures are just like, it's just everything's moving downhill as fast as possible, unfortunately. And as we kind of alluded to earlier, it's hard to know a way out of this. Maybe the last question I'll kind of ask you here before we draw things to a close is, um, how do you tie this to, like, your in your personal faith and just kind of like trying to maintain optimism, trying to maintain that, even in the midst of all this suffering and hardship, that Christ is in control. How does that play into what you do, and then how does your faith in sort of like inspire you to try to call for peace? I mean, uh, I think especially as you said, like this has kind of been like a recent thing for you. Is that sort of like uh, increased the sort of like heart you have to really speak out against war and to, I mean, for me, it's like I'm constantly asking people like how many of these Palestinians who have been, killed or dislocated, uh, haven't heard, I mean, there's Christians living in Gaza, but still, how many of them hadn't really heard the gospel yet? Or how many of them now only associate Christianity with, like, well, the Western nations are Christian and Jewish, and they're the ones who have destroyed my home and my family. So it's just like, to me, it really like gets me sort of like fired up to be like, I, I, I feel even more convicted to be a soldier for Christ and His kingdom, to be out there preaching the gospel and to preach it not only for the salvation of individuals, but for like the salvation of the world, to have peace on this world, to have nations repenting and coming to Christ. I mean, that's the way I view it. But what are your thoughts on that? How do you kind of approach it, and what's your, how does that drive you?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough. It's definitely helped me be able to kind of deal with all this stuff. Just my faith and prayer and everything. And it is kind, it's really tough. You mentioned how many of them have heard the gospel. How many of these kids that have been killed have heard it? And what is one thing that maybe could change things is like a mass conversion in the region. So that's something I pray for. Um, and it's a kind of a very Catholic thing. I have the Our Lady of Guadalupe above me, which I didn't even realize the kind of significance of that. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but basically it was an apparition that Mexican peasant saw, and it imprinted this image on his robe or cloak or whatever exactly he was wearing. There's a lot more to. I didn't explain it very well, but it basically led to a mass conversion in Mexico. So I pray for things like that, and I just it's hard, to try to figure it all out, but it just it certainly helps me cope with kind of the evil in the world, understanding that the enemy is this is his world, and we're kind of in exile on it, and we have our promised land when the life is over on this earth, so that you hope for the kids getting killed, that they'll I pray that for their souls, that they'll find salvation and everything too.
Yeah. No, I 100% agree. I think that's a great way of putting it. It's like there's so much fight over this land, and don't get me wrong, like yeah, like part of me is intrigued, even somewhat inspired by the original Holy Land and the sites there. I think that it's fine to have a reverence for it, to have an admiration for it, but we ultimately have a greater promise, which is a promised eternity with Christ and the new heavens and the new earth, and the church that Christ established, and that's our true inheritance, and it's something that we can call all people of all creeds, all races, all nations to, and um, it's the true antidote to all this conflict going on, and so we continue to pray for that. And I pray for you and everyone at antiwar.com. You guys keep doing the work you do, because the truth sets you free, and that's of course not just true for your salvation, but I hope that the more that you guys can, shine light on what's going on, that as people learn more, that also increases the calls for ceasefires, the calls for peace, the calls for governments to be held to account, and to, be actual servants to the people and not just to their own imperial agendas. So, Dave, if you want to give any closing thoughts, and then tell people where they can find you, where they can support your work and all that before we sign off here.
Yeah, you could find me at antiwar.com. That's where all my writing is. Again, in the news section. Listen to my show. It's called Anti-War News. It's on YouTube, or you could listen to the podcast or watch on Rumble if you prefer. And follow me on Twitter at DeCamp Dave. Follow antiwar.com there as well.
Of course, someone made a quick comment I would read. Thomas said 19 out of 20 of my Catholic buddies are totally opposed to Israel's war. Yeah, the
Nice.
Catholics and the Eastern Orthodox tend to be a lot better on this than my evangelicals. I'm working on them. I need your guys' help to get the evangelicals out of the clutches of Zionism and dispensationalism. And that was also part of the reason I wanted to have Dave on. And Dave, I appreciate you coming on. This was a great conversation. Everybody watching, if you haven't already, please like this video and subscribe. That way more people can see this. If you want to share it on your social media feeds as well, that's always a great help and greatly appreciated. I don't have any more live streams scheduled for this week, but I just wanted to plug that next week on election night, starting at 8 p.m., we here at the Libertarian Christian Institute will be doing some live, maybe all night. We'll see how long we want to go for, but some live election night coverage, talking about stuff. And we're going to have kind of a rotation of different guests coming in for that as well. So stay tuned for that. And that's all we have for you guys for tonight. I appreciate you tuning in. As I always conclude by saying, live at peace and live for Christ. Take care.